Good afternoon, students. It looks like we're back into, I guess, what we would have to now define as the new normal. Um, this obviously is this discussion, this lecture will be for the Shakespeare students, but if any of the world literature students happen to view it, that's perfectly fine. Again, I hope all of you are doing well, or shall I put it this way, as well as can be expected. Uh, I have finished your questions that you submitted over the Merchant of Venice, and I will get those to you, your grades through email. I'll try to work on some of this over the weekend. I'm still trying to grade the Iliad major exam, and I'm making good progress there. And what we will do is today I'm going to give a kind of what I consider to be maybe a kind of brief textual analysis of parts of the Merchant of Venice. Understand if we were in a true, I guess, class situation, I would have to spend a little bit more time and would want to. But I'm also cognizant of the fact that we've got to move on a little bit. So you're already by now very familiar with the play. And I thought that in your interest, and it also makes me feel that I'm actually doing my duty. I want to go into the text with you a bit, and as I've done in the past, sort of do an analysis of some important passages, and I think you may feel more comfortable. And after doing this, for a couple of perhaps at least one more discussion, we'll talk about a major exam, maybe sometimes next week. So to begin, let's look in Act 1, Scene 1, and you understand as I look over, as I've done in class, I'm looking at the text, and I'm going to call your attention to certain passages. And I will begin again in Act 1, Scene 1, about line 130. And you will see that Bassanio is talking to Antonio. And let's look at what he says here. He says, I owe the most in money and in love. And from your love, I have a warranty to unburden all my plots and purposes, how to get clear of all the debts I owe. Now, I would like for you to spend a little bit of time and examine this passage. And as you look at it, you're going to have a kind of insight, don't you see, into Bassanio's value system. Now, notice what he says first. I owe the most in money and in love. Notice, I think for all purposes, maybe if the relationship had not had been a little bit more dependent upon feeling, maybe for all purposes, you would see that money would not have come in a sense first, but it does. So by now you understand that money does very much play an important part in their relationship. So what you're finding here is Bassanio very much emphasizes the monetary, less so the emotional. Now it's in reverse with Antonio. Very much, you know that he has this emotional attachment to Bassanio, but the idea is, in order to, shall we say, continue that emotional relationship that Antonio has Bassanio, money does play an important part. You're almost going to want to reach the conclusion that Antonio is willing to help Bassanio, but perhaps, as we shall see as we get further into the play, there may be a kind of catch to it. So, really, this moment tells us how you're going to want to judge Bassanio. Remember what I told you last time, as we talked about the play as a problem play. Bassanio must come across very much as this so-called problematic, if I can even use the word, hero. Notice, in the course of the play, the plot does not allow him to perform any kind of heroic action. Unlike you found with Orlando, don't you see, in As You Like It. Now, after they have talked a bit, and Bassanio has expressed to Antonio his financial need, will you move down to about line 160? And he's telling Antonio about Portia and what it will be required of Bassanio to go to Belmont and participate in the so-called lottery. So it reads, I'm about line 160. He says, in Belmont is a lady richly left, and she is fair and fairer, of wondrous virtues. Sometimes from her eyes I did receive fair speechless messages. Her name is Portia, nothing undervalued. Her name is Portia, nothing undervalued. I want you to see that. That's why I read it again. To Cato's daughter, Brutus's Portia. This is why I explained to you, one way in terms of appearance and reality, you immediately can say for all purposes that she is this woman of virtue. But I said that was too simplistic, if you will, an interpretation. Now, move on down and you have an interesting insight here. I would be about line 175, and look what he says. And many Jasons come in quest of her. And then he says to Antonio, to hold a rival place with one of them. And then he says that I should questionless be fortunate. Now, one thing you're going to have to do is to judge Bassanio in terms of what will constitute romantic comedy. What he wants to do, obviously, is to go to Belmont, and in going to Belmont, for all purposes, he wants to come across very much as a kind of respectable suitor. But as you look too very carefully, once again, there's going to be this kind of emphasis placed, don't you see, on money. Notice where he, in that first line I read to you, in Belmont is a lady richly left. Don't you see? Sort of remindful of what I just read to you about line 130 in terms of Antonio. Now, you're going to have to sort of see, is he really all that respectable? Some will say, for all purposes, that he's nothing more than this, I suppose, unfeeling spendthrift, that in a sense he uses people to, my gosh, obviously help him alleviate his debts. So he too, that's why I used the word a moment ago, he is a kind of problematic character, don't you see? But I want to play upon this idea of where I think it's such an appropriate analogy when he says, and many Jasons come in quest of her. One thing, there's the idea of the so-called journey motif. He too, Bassanio, will undergo the rite of journey. He's going to make a journey to Belmont. Now, what you have to take into account here, this is not quite the movement theme that I called your attention to in As You Like It. In other words, what Shakespeare is trying to do is to draw a comparison between the two cities, Venice, and then you look in terms of Belmont. Venice is the opposite of Belmont. We already, I think, had discussed before the break that you would characterize Venice as very commercial. The idea that a great deal of activity is taking place every day. It's noisy. A lot of, as you're going to find out in terms of your reading, a lot of deal making, that sort of thing. A lot of secretive intrigues, so forth. Whereas Belmont, in fact, in translation, Belmont means fine, F-I-N-E, mountain. It's isolated. It's quiet. Very much serene. So there's this good contrast, if you will, between the two. Now, what I wanted to say in terms of the analogy, the idea is that Jason and Bassanio, this is such an apt, if you will, analogy. Once again, I apologize, my clock is going on, but it could become an interesting, if you will, distraction. For all purposes, you remember in mythology that Jason was the leader of the Argonauts, and he did undergo a quest, a journey in pursuit of what was called the Golden Fleece, which was obviously made of pure gold. And whoever obtained the Golden Fleece not only would have the riches, but also the power. And so he's making this journey, and he can't quite do it just on his own. For example, one thing he's going to have to rely upon will be the help of his crew members. But also when it comes time to actually, and he will, steal the Golden Fleece, he can't do it by himself. Now think about it in terms of our play. He is going to have the aid of a woman. A little bit later, think about Bassanio and Portia. Now there's a dragon that does not sleep. It guards the entrance to anyone trying to come and steal the Golden Fleece. You've all heard of Medea, who has fallen in love, and don't ask me why, with Jason. So what she's going to do is to drug the dragon so that when it falls asleep, understand it's not supposed to, but she does drug the dragon, and Jason, in a very sneaky way, rushes in and snatches the Golden Fleece. My point to you is he does it with the aid of Medea. Think about a little bit later, why do you think that Bassanio makes the right choice in terms of choosing the casket, the leaden casket that he does? So very much I wanted to call your attention here. So I think this should provide you a kind of good insight. Now, I'd like to skip over to scene 3 for a moment. And as you go in terms of scene 3, my reference to you will be about line 41 in scene 3. Shylock is speaking an aside, and what's to happen, he's going to very shortly speak to Bassanio and Antonio. But as they're making Antonio's making his appearance, notice what Shylock says, and I'm about line 45. How like a fawning publican he looks. Now, when he uses the word publican in this sense, it means like a tax gatherer. I hate him, for he's not a Christian, but more for that in low simplicity he lends out money gratis and brings down the rate of usurance here with us in Venice. Remember, I've already told you the difference between the two in terms of their lending abilities. And notice what he says, if I can catch him
Once upon the hip, I will feed fat the ancient grudge I bear him. All of you review why this feeling on the part of Shylock, a Jew, toward the Christians. He hates our sacred nation, and he rails even there when merchants most do congregate on me, my bargains, and my well-won thrift, which he calls interest. Cursed be my tribe if I forgive him. Now, the reason for calling your attention to this passage, I wanted to clearly to establish his motivation. And when I say motivation, you've got to take this motivation, I think, very serious. Now, he believes in obtaining very much what he wants. Now, money is very much going to be lent for gain. It's not going to be lent, in a sense, for, shall we say, relationships. So, take into account now, someone to dismiss and say, oh, he doesn't really mean this. Now, move on into the text, if you will, a little bit, and go to about line 150. And notice as you look about line 150, Shylock, for all purposes, will agree to participate in this so-called deal. So he says, this kindness will I show. Go with me to a notary, and me there, your single bond, and in a merry sport, if you repay me not on such a day, in such a place, such sum or sums as are expressed in the condition, let the forfeit be nominated for an equal pound of your fair flesh to be cut off and taken in what part of your body pleaseth me. Now, that's an interesting, shall we say, passage where he says, for an equal pound of your fair flesh to be cut off and taken in what part of your body pleaseth me. That phrase has almost become a kind of metaphor, and it suggests a kind of relentless greed, also a kind of relentless determination. So, if anyone says, I'm going to get a pound of your flesh, metaphorically, they're determined to get, if you will, what they want. Now, Antonian, in particular, will not take Shylock that seriously. In fact, if you will look as we conclude the scene, go to about line 180. Look what Antonio had said about Shylock before, and because Shylock is so willing to engage in this deal, Antonio thinks for all purposes, hie thee, gentle Jew, the Hebrew will turn Christian, he grows kind. See how he's convinced that he can, and you got to read into it a little bit, if you will, a level of a kind of hypocrisy, if you will. Okay, so my point to you, the deal is for real. Shylock takes it very seriously. Now, it's up to Antonio and Bassanio, and for all purposes, they're going to be a little bit dismissal, if you will, of the deal. They're not going to say, oh, well, he doesn't mean this. And also, you have to take into account that they're not going to take Shylock very seriously. One thing, he's a Jew, and also the idea is that he's almost coming across as a kind of villainous character. And the notion is, hey, we don't have to pay him back. Now, move on into Act 2 and look at the opening lines of Act 2. You're going to be introduced to one of three principal suitors
And I would like for you to pay a little bit of attention to the three suitors, and in time, note the significance of the content of their choice in choosing one of the chests or one of the caskets. Morocco is our first, and he says, as you begin the scene, mislike me not for my complexion. Now, all of you, if not, look up and know where, for all purposes, Morocco comes. Some will define him as a Moor. In other words, for all purposes, what I want you to see here is he is a person of dark complexion, and he believes in this notion of heroic exploits. And notice as he reads here how he's made a name for himself. He's also a little bit, if any of you are familiar with Marlowe's play Tamburlaine, he reminds me here a bit of a kind of Tamburlaine character. Love for him is to desire what every man has or may desire. This is why he's going to make the choice that he does. Now, look at the end. Now, when I called your attention, mislike me not for my complexion. Notice in the course of the various scenes how Portia is going to react. You remember I told you that if you read in between the lines a little bit, she's almost going to show a kind of racial bias here toward him. All right. Now she gives him a kind of warning. As you look at the end of the scene, this is to me a very important passage. I'm about line 50. And Morocco says, come, bring me unto my chance. He's very self-assured. He very much is, I would think, quite self-controlled. And he's eager to go and make his choice. Now, Shakespeare is going to delay just a little bit in order, to build up a kind of suspense. You don't want this to happen entirely too fast. Notice Portia. First, forward to the temple. After dinner. Now, here's what's most important. Your hazard shall be made. Now, the notion is hazard. There's got to be this willingness to take a risk, even if you may, in a sense, fail. Love, for example, is a kind of risk. It's a kind of venture. It's a kind of an investment. It's an emotional investment. As with all investments, listen, we can ruin ourselves, or we may, if we make the right emotional investment, my gosh, we can, and here's your theme of gain, we may gain something that is beyond measure. See my point here? Now, I'm going to skip over a little bit, and this is going to be another development, if you will, in terms of the plot. I'm looking to make sure I'm in scene 2. I want you to go now to scene 3. I'm still in Act 2, and I want you to look in terms of scene 3. The moment between Jessica and Lancelot. They're speaking here in terms of this passage. And notice about line 18, 15. And she, obviously speaking too of Lorenzo. She says, farewell, good Lancelot. Alack, what heinous sin is it in me? Now notice these lines. To be ashamed to be my father's child, for though I am a daughter to his blood, I am not to his manners. O Lorenzo, if thou keep promise, I shall end this strife. Notice, become a Christian and thy loving wife.
some critics have said, for all purposes, that she's pretty heartless here. And what it amounts to, you've got to draw a kind of distinction, in a sense, and here's part of one of the reasons why the play can be read, again, as a kind of social problem. In other words, how important is race in this play, and how important is religion? In other words, which, in a sense, may be the easier to give up? In other words, take into account, can you cross over from one religion to another? What about race? This is, in other words, the decision that she's about to make may be a kind of end to her heritage. This would bother Shylock, if you will, very much. So I wanted to call your attention there. Now, I want you to go to scene 7, and I'm going to take scene 7 for all purposes, and this will be a very important moment for us. I want you to look at Morocco, and he's going to make his drawing. He will draw his casket, in other words. So in scene 7, as you look at the beginning, lines 5 along in there, and understand it's going to take him a long time to make his mind up. But that's a good delay tactic on the part of Shakespeare. So as he's making his examination now, so he says, for all purposes, the first of gold, who this inscription bears, who chooseth me shall gain what many men desire. Remember I told you that a moment ago. The second silver, which this promise carries, who chooseth me shall get as much as he deserves. And look at this. Who chooseth me must give and hazard all he hath. Remember I told you about love as being a true investment? Choose correctly. You may be rich beyond measure. Now, go ahead and look in terms of his choice. And as you look about line 65, look at the inscription and look inside of the casket and see what he has drawn. His choice, obviously he will choose the gold casket. And once again, it ties in very much, if you will, with this theme of appearance and reality. So, for all purposes, he has chosen, if you will, the casket. Now, the gold casket. All right, he has judged by appearance. In other words, if you look at the gold casket, men by appearance will say, hey, gold. The notion is, if you judge by appearance, you leap to the conclusion that if it's gold on the surface, there must be gold inside as well. In other words, he's thinking the riches are beyond measure inside. In other words, he's looking, if you will, for tangible reasons inside the casket. Look what he finds instead. Isn't that interesting? Now, what I'd like to do, and this will be my concluding, since I'm already 30 minutes into what I wanted to be a kind of 15-minute analysis, and then probably on Monday, I'll continue with another. I'll pick out some more passages, and then finally, in time, go ahead and conclude the play. But if you really want the answer to the meaning of the casket, the gold casket, I need to relate a story, but I'm going to relate this story. It's not by Shakespeare. I want you to think about, and I suppose in your career, all of you have been familiar with Chaucer. You've read the Canterbury Tales. All right? Well, in the Canterbury Tales, I made the discovery that there is one tale in particular
that sums up the essence of what the gold casket represents. And what I have to do is to go to what's called the Pardoner's Tale. And what the pilgrims did, there was a prologue to the tale that they're about to tell. And I'm not going to go into the whole rendition, if you will, of the Canterbury Tales, but I will tell you a little bit, and then I will relate the story to you, and you will see very much what it means in terms of Morocco's choice here. So the host, in terms of the Canterbury's Tale, will turn to the pardoner, and he says, I want you to now begin your tale. And he tells the pardoner, why don't you tell a tale that's going to have a kind of merry, a little kind of a farcical insight. But then some of the pilgrims interject, and they say, I want to hear a tale that has a kind of moral to it. So the pardoner is obliging, and he has asked for a drink, he's asked for some food, and he begins to talk about himself a bit. Now, he wants to very much define his profession, and his profession is that of being a kind of itinerant preacher. He's going to go around teaching about religion, about belief, about avoiding, if you will, sin. And then he's going to want to sell promises of salvation. And his topic is always the same. Money is, or greed, is the root of all evil. So this is going to be a kind of sermon that he makes. And he says, I'm going to tell you this tale, and then after the tale, you might be interested in buying some of my wares. And he's going to pull out a book of, he has a bag of relics in, and he readily admits that these are all fake. In other words, if you will buy some of my relics, these are going to be symbolic of a move toward salvation, also a move that will provide miraculous healing powers for all kinds of ailments. In other words, it's going to be, you remember one of these roving in, when you read Tales of the Old West, one of these traveling about vagabonds who would sell these tonics that would cure all ailments. So he says, please buy some of my relics. And even though he's already told people that they're no good, they still are going to buy these. So the pardoner's not a very good character in terms of Chaucer, but I think you're going to appreciate his tale. So here's a kind of summary of it. He's going to talk about a group of young Belgian people. They're 3 men, for example, and they spend all of their time drinking, carousing. They indulge in, if you will, all forms of debauchery, excess. And he's going to talk about, for example, the sin of gluttony, the sin of swearing, and so forth. All right. So then he had a mild, the pardoner interrupts for a moment, and then he's going to pick up with his tale. And he says, these 3 young men are in a place where they're drinking and making noise. And outside, they hear a funeral knell. And they go out and find out that one of their friends has been slain by a mysterious enemy. I should say, maybe not enemy, a mysterious figure named Death. And these rioters, these 3 young men, are outraged. And what they want to do in their drunkenness is to avenge the death of their friend. So they want to know where they can find death. So they're going to travel down the road, and they come across an old man, and they will ask him, "Can you tell us where we can find death?" And the old man tells them, "Travel, and you will come to an oak tree. And when you get to the oak tree, there you will find the figure of death." These three young men make their way, but when they get to the oak tree, they don't see an image of death, a figure of death. Instead, they see 8 bushels of gold coins, and there's no owner in sight. Can you imagine? They're very speechless almost in terms of their finding. And they're very excited. See, momentarily they forgot about seeking vengeance upon the death of their friend. So in a sense, they talk it over, and they decide, well, look, we're going to have to wait until night and take these gold coins and try to sell them. We can't take them into the city right now because people will think that we're thieves. So as soon as it's going to become dark, we'll take the coins into the city. So they decide in the meantime, let's rest and have some drink and food. And they decide that they're going to draw lots. And the one who will lose in terms of the drawing, likely the one who will draw the shortest, will have to go into the city and buy some wine and cheese, bread, whatever. Well, it happens that the youngest of the 3 loses, and he has to go off into the city and buy the wine and the cheese, the bread, that sort of thing. Well, what happens is while he's gone, the other 2 talk it over, and look at the moral of the sermon. They decide, well, don't you think it might be better if we divide our loot into 2 rather than 3? So they decide that they're going to kill this young man once he comes back. And they will have all of the riches, if you will, for themselves. All right, so they agree that this is going to happen. Well, once the young man is in the, purchasing the wine and food, he decides, why can't I be the richest man? In other words, I can have all of this gold for myself. So he goes to the apothecary, and he's going to buy the strongest poison available. All right? Now, he will put the poison into each of 2 bottles of wine, and obviously he's not going to put it into the 3rd. All right? What's going to happen, he will get back to where the other 2 are. He will give them a bottle of the poisoned wine. They will drink the poisoned wine, and then before they die, they kill him. So for all purposes, look what happens. Did you see? Very much money, greed, the root of all evil. Now you see the significance of what Morocco finds in the golden casket, the skull. Now, it is almost 40 minutes, and I think that this is enough for today. Let me conclude by saying, go ahead and have a good weekend. I will mail back very shortly your grade over the questions that you submitted over the Merchant of Venice, and I will announce another discussion of the Merchant of Venice. Really, have a very good day. Thank you.